Welcome to Real Estate Radio Live, an informative and engaging podcast discussing everything you need to know about the world of real estate. Your host, Joe Caccera, provides you with insight and guidance on how to buy, sell, finance, and invest in real estate. He also offers real estate tax management strategies, new construction advice, home improvement tips, and much, much more. And now, to guide you around the world of real estate, here's your host and Real Estate Radio Live team leader, Joe Caccera.
Welcome in, Joe Caccera with Real Estate Radio Live. Thank you for those that continue to follow the show, and we're on and off on Facebook. This is a podcast, however, so remember to download the podcast when you get a chance. Just a reminder, too, before I forget and before we bring Jack in, we had a webinar last week, went really well. If you haven't seen that yet, go in and log in, get the podcast, or go to our website. We ran about an hour and a half, so it's not like a normal podcast, but we've got a great panelist of guests, CEOs and executives from the real estate industry. We also had the CEO at New American Funding, and we had the chief economist from the California Association of Realtors jump in and talk a little bit about the market as well. So a lot of changes going on in the real estate market. Before we jump into the last thing today, Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, I believe now, are allowing real estate agents to show consumers private showings. That's a big change starting next week because before you could not show a property unless it was vacant. Starting next week, you can do a private showing on a house. So more to come. Keep an eye on that. For more information, check out the website and the podcast at RERL-1715.com. All right, we're with Jack Russo, the managing partner of the Computer Law Group. Good to have you back, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think you're doing a great work, and I think the show you just referred to is going to become one of your top 10 shows this year. So I don't doubt that you're going to get a lot more people listening to you because you're bringing some really great guests on. I'm glad to be part of that.
Yeah, no, it's a great show. It's a lot of changes taking place for sure, and this is always a great segment, and it's been a great show the last couple of years. We get a lot of response. Matter of fact, before I forget, I had two clients that I talked to this past week, Jack, that both reference your shows, the last two shows we did.
Well, this notion of too small to fail, people appreciate that. That's a lot of the reason that many people like small business. Right. And America still is mostly small business. Of course, a small business these days is, according to the SBA, anyone that has under 500 employees. That's still a lot of employees. I think of small businesses as typically under 10 employees, and often under 5, and usually those 5 may be even mostly family members who are pulling together in the hard times. Right. We talked about it last week, and I think we talked about at least 3 different components, which is loyal people serving loyal customers or loyal clients, as the case may be, and then an infrastructure, really a supply chain, a supply and delivery chain for the products or services that are being delivered that are kind of building a brand. And we talked about how banks are pretty important in financing the whole thing. If you don't have investors, oftentimes people have investors as well, and that's kind of another leg to the wheel or to the stool. That's pretty important.
Right.
And the investors certainly are being called upon to kind of provide additional capital and guarantees and lots of other things, as is the SBA and the U.S. government and everyone else.
Do you think there's going to kind of we're going to talk about too big to fail, but since you're obviously your expertise and law background, do you think that there's going to be an incredible amount of lawsuits and legal issues surrounding all kinds of aspects that we're not even thinking of right now with COVID-19, but also as it relates to business in general?
Yeah, it's already started, and it started in like 5 different ways. I'll just list them, and people will say, wow, 5 different ways. Yeah. There are people that have already sued the country of China. Taking the view that the Chinese caused this. It's a multi-trillion dollar, people are talking about it by the end of the day being maybe 50 trillion. So that's just to size that's like basically 50 Apples, Microsofts, basically combine all those companies and add them to 50 such companies, and you got the economic effect for what, like 3 months, I guess,
Right.
So it's not even a year yet. It's not even a quarter of a year yet. It's not even really a calendar quarter yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's at the highest level. Then at the extremely low level, lawsuits are piling in where people that have office leases are saying, I'm not going back in that building where you have to take an elevator to the 8th floor because your elevators don't operate so fast, and I'm not waiting, and I'm not going to get in an elevator with 12 other people. So think of the office buildings that go to the 80th floor, like in Manhattan or in say, San Francisco. Who wants to be in an elevator when someone might sneeze, even if it's just one other person?
Right.
So what do you do with those elevators? So that's like, the mega event, and then there's the sort of, what practical problem of what do you do at space that you require an elevator to get up to? And in between, there's like 3 other classes of cases that are already being filed. There's a case that is cases being filed against insurance companies saying this is a business disruption within the terms of a policy that talks about coverage for business disruption. So some policies exist that deal with business disruption, and they're taking the view, and typically this is for tornadoes and earthquakes and various weather events, because that's typically how you see it. And there are people that are filing lawsuits based on those policies. There are shareholders, this is the other of the 3 classes of cases, shareholders filing lawsuits against board members and against boards of directors and companies saying you should have anticipated that the business would need a larger reserve to stay operating, and you did not do prudent planning as a business. Look at Tim Cook at Apple. He's stockpiled hundreds of millions of dollars, probably hundreds of billions of dollars now. Someone should get that number, but it's a big number, is stockpiled in cash and T-bills.
Wow.
And everyone thought he was crazy. But he is now able to ride Apple through this storm. Same for Google, probably same for Facebook. These are the guys that are arguably too big to fail because they actually have done some very conservative accounting and very conservative cash management. Well, we know there's a lot of businesses that have done the opposite.
Right.
So does that make the directors and officers of that business a breach of fiduciary duty because they've not done smart planning, and they might be on the edge of bankruptcy such that all the shareholder equity is going to zero?
Wow.
I mean, think about that. And then finally, there's the case, the traditional case you see, which is people get fired, they get furloughed, they get laid off, and they still turn around and say, I shouldn't have been fired. I was really doing really good work, and basically you took advantage of me because you should have fired somebody else.
Yeah.
You kept the younger person and you fired me, age discrimination. You kept the white person and you fired me, race discrimination.
Right.
You kept the Jewish guy and you fired me, religious discrimination. And so we're seeing that kind of thing play out as well. And I'm sure people will say it's way more than 5 categories, but those are the 5 categories I've seen already. I'm sure we're going to see new categories pop up left, right, and sideways as we see more and more people basically say, look, this was not really anticipated.
Yeah.
This was not something that anyone really planned for, and who should have planned for it? It shouldn't be me. Let it be somebody else, right?
Well, that's interesting. I don't want to, this is not really the show to do it, but it gets me thinking. So is there maybe it's too broad of a question. Is there a legal position or legal stance with someone that says, hey, how come our president, how come our shareholders, how come no one thought about this or had a provision in place and plan just in case something like this happened? If we'd have known, then we might not have invested in this company. I mean, I'm throwing stuff out, but
I think that's exactly the theory. The theory is that if you're a fiduciary, you're supposed to wear a very wide range lens, glasses, looking at every potentiality, and even some that you might say, that's implausible. Virus, worldwide pandemic, that's just not going to happen in my lifetime. Why do I have to worry about that? And they'd say, because Bill Gates 6 years ago said that it's happening and it will happen and we should get ready for it. and a bunch of other people have supported him in books and articles and TED Talks and a huge number of things. So it should have been on your radar. You know, years ago as a law firm, we never thought there was even a 1/100th of 1% chance, 0.0000000, and then maybe a 1% chance. You know, the Ivory soap commercial is like 99.44, 100% pure.
Right.
We never thought there was even a possibility that an ex-client would come in with a machine gun and gun down the partners, but then it happened.
Yeah.
Competitive Martin on the top floor of the tower, the Pyramid Tower in San Francisco.
Yeah.
The next month, that firm closed down.
There was a movie about that.
Yeah, an irate client came in with a machine gun and gunned down the entire 38th floor of lawyers. I think they had like 25 deaths and 70 people wounded. It was terrible.
Yeah.
Now it's on people's radar. So, you know, if there's a disgruntled client, there are law firms that literally hire security to make sure that guy or gal doesn't get in.
Wow.
Like literally, they take that view. And obviously, you might say that's like such a low chance of someone going berserk. But it's in the news, right? You see it day in and day out. It's here. It's prevalent. It's got to be on your radar.
Yeah.
And so people are talking about the federal government will probably have something like the TSA, you know, which is currently does all the wacky stuff to get on a flight.
Right.
You know, do you have 3 ounces of liquid or 3.6 ounces? And they're making sure nothing's getting through. And you know, I can't tell you how many, you know, corkscrews have been pulled out of my bag just because I carry a corkscrew with me to open a bottle of wine on the road. It's pathetic, right? I probably lost so many of those as I think about it.
Yeah.
Or sometimes I bring I have one of the, although I didn't use it today, I have one of those old-fashioned razor blades with the blades that still go in, because my dad used that years ago, and I've got his handle from like the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
You could still buy the blades, but they're not easy to find. You know, the Wilkinson sword, single edge or double edge blades. And they pull it.
Wow.
They're like, you can't have that.
Yeah.
I'm like, just take the blades. They're like, no, we're taking the whole friggin' thing. I'm like, come on, you can't do that. I got to negotiate with them. They're like, you can't bring that.
Yeah.
So imagine if we have a TSA that's more like the VSA, Virus Security Agency, you know, Transportation Security Agency becomes the Viral Security Agency or Virus Security Agency. They're going to be taking blood samples from us.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to get all that data and figure out just how screwed up Americans are. Americans have a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of research that flows from all that data draw, which they're going to say is anonymous. I don't know if it's really going to be anonymous. At some level, you could say maybe it's okay. The Chinese think it's okay, but a lot of Americans are like, hey, my privacy is too important. I'm not going to give my DNA.
Look at how everybody trusted Facebook, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, on a different level, and that's a completely different level. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
So conceptually, we're on the topic of too big to fail, and the reason we're contrasting it with too small to fail is when you're really big, and I mean really big. I typically think of big as anyone that's over 1,000 employees, and let's say the employees are actually doing pretty good work. That typically means the revenue is north of 300,000 per person. Okay. So when you do those numbers, if you're doing those numbers, usually if the employee is making 100,000 fully loaded with, you know, on average with all benefits and whatnot, then the company's got 2/3 to play with. That's sort of, you could argue, sort of gross margin in a service business. You could argue if you're doing the numbers really fast. So you're talking about a business that is really kicking ass, 30 million plus in revenue, you know, really doing pretty well in producing major revenue.
Right.
So if you take that view that you're dealing with a business that is that size, typically it's on a growth path that may be getting to 300 million in revenue and then maybe getting to maybe even 3 billion in revenue. I mean, those tend to be businesses that are getting really big.
Yeah.
And ideally they're getting big based on infrastructure and not employee headcount, which is why the three legs of having infrastructure that works with automation becomes so important, because you don't want to keep adding employees. If you can avoid it, you really want to add infrastructure. So every time Netflix adds a server, just figuratively, they do it differently than one server at a time, but every time they add more computing power, that's brilliant, because that is a fixed cost with no benefits, no termination costs. In fact, they don't even add it, they lease it, typically from Amazon Web Services or from Microsoft Azure or IBM. There's a group of different companies that supply this infrastructure. And that's the best way to go, because it's like turning up the tap. You use more electricity and you use more water and you use more of the quote unquote utility, but you get paid more by your customers.
Yeah, I mean, the whole theory, right, Jack? I mean, all of us, I mean, Bundle Selects, that the goal is that you establish this company, and then as you expand and grow, depending on the infrastructure and the way it's manifested, that when you open up a city or a state, you're not actually adding manpower or opening offices and buildings and employees.
You're turning on a server. So in businesses like that, and I think of Google as a good example, Facebook is another example, and Netflix is an example. They all have their nuances, because Netflix has to put money out for original series programs that get people's eyeballs. You know, Breaking Bad was a big, or I guess whoever did Breaking Bad, now it's on Netflix. It was somebody else, I think, that HBO or Showtime started it, and then they syndicated it. But conceptually, there's usually kind of a head count that grows with expansion because of customer support and billing and all this stuff that gets automated, but there are limits to the automation, and people want some service, some support, someone answering the phone, someone following up, that sort of thing. And at some level, the question becomes, can you scale with profit and on a continuous basis? And then when the event occurs, in this case, a massive disruption, does the infrastructure substitute for the people showing up to work? And so far, in most of these big businesses, with a very few exceptions, it has actually worked. The Zoom meetings, the phone meetings, the internet, the email, the text, the Slack, the this, the that, the Teams, all these things seem to be substituting for physical contact, which is pretty much destroying the airlines. I mean, no one's getting on a plane anymore. Even if they could, they're not doing it. Even if they could, for a big deal, they're saying, let's try to set the table by phone. Even for a big settlement conference, which historically I do a lot of pro bono work for the federal and state courts, no more in-person stuff for probably all of the rest of this year.
Wow, really? That long?
Do it by Zoom. Yeah, their view of the courts is, we know you're valuable as a pro bono servant. We're not going to enable sickness or cause sickness, and someone's going to come back to us and say, why did you force them to do it in person? So they're taking the extremely conservative view. If you're doing pro bono work, you do it by phone, and if you're savvy, you can use Zoom. They don't expect to pay you for the Zoom account that you need to set up, because Zoom stops at 40 minutes, as we know, and just shuts down on the non-paid free account. You have the regular account. Most people are going to be forced to get the regular account and to do their work, because unfortunately they don't take seriously the 40-minute limit. And if you're doing a mediation, that's typically a 7-hour discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of a case that might otherwise take 7 days to 7 weeks to trial. So the investment is worth it in general. So conceptually, that work is all being done pro bono over the phone or through Zoom or Teams or Skype or some other form of Google video is out there too. Google just gave its commercial version for free with unlimited time to compete against Zoom. Because they see Zoom pulling too many eyeballs over to Zoom. So there you go. And what they did, just so you know, because you may want to test this, I just got off a call on Google. They actually put closed caption instantaneous voice to text. As I was talking, text was rolling in the bottom of the screen.
Really? Hmm.
Pretty accurate too.
Wow.
Really accurate. I
Well,
mean,
those are all going to
that
come
down.
a big, yeah, those will all become a bigger part, play a bigger part in communication and the way we interact, the way we do business. I mean, this is, what's interesting is we said this before, but in the too big to fail, part of this whole process is kind of the re-engineering. You wonder how many companies right now, or certainly by the end of this year, or as this phases back in, that take a complete look from top to bottom, to their organization, to commercial leases, to, I mean, I don't care what it is, how we're doing business. I mean, I'll give you an example. New American Funding, the lender in which we partner with, right? So they overnight, 90% of their workforce started working out of their house, right? And guess what? In the months of April and now the months of March and now April, they're going to have record months of closing loans.
Wow.
And 90% aren't even in buildings.
So people became more productive.
Yeah, interesting, right?
Wow.
How many companies you think, I mean, that could be an anomaly, I'm not sure, but I'm not so sure in a world in which we're connected all over the place anyway, that companies across the board, whether it's a CEO, a director, partner, are going to look at their organizations going, what did we just learn?
It's already happening, Joe. I can tell you, I've been in a few board meetings, but I could also tell you, obviously, the companies I'm on the board of are typically small and growing companies.
Right.
But I can tell you that Andrew Gardner, who you had on your show,
Yep,
and who runs the hierarchy for big HR departments at big, too big to fail type companies, you should get him on the show, because he reports that the whole HR function's changing. The whole way people are hired or not hired is changing. The whole way in which people are deciding what is the role of the office for people being hired or being allowed to return versus the role of the person who really is not a core decision maker and can do their support work in the background, doesn't need to be at the office. They can shrink a lot of their core decision space to or meeting space to where there's really decisions being made. Everything else is a support function. Everything else doesn't need to even be in that building. That means less people driving cars, less traffic, less gasoline, less pollution, less flying around. I mean, think of it. It's really a radical way to retool America to what's essential versus what's not essential.
Right.
We used to think years ago that lawyers needed a law library. You had to have a law library, which meant you had to have shelves, you had to have a building, you had to have a room, you had to have physical premises to store and update the books. That's over. This room used to be a complete library of every federal reporter from the beginning of the federal court system in the 18th century to the present.
Yeah.
There isn't a single federal reporter here. We gave them all away pro bono to the prisons, because the prisoners still read those books to try to get out of jail, because they don't have online services, although I'm told now some of them do. Everything is now online. There is no need for a library. There's no need for the physical space or the physical books.
Right. But do you think also what's interesting is, real quick, if you could speak to that, is that, years ago, or even to a certain extent, maybe our generation, I'll speak to my generation older, one of the things you did when you walked into a law firm, one of the things that caught your eye or impressed you is, my God, look at the wall-to-wall books and all the legal doc. I mean, in other words, was it a perception or a thought that maybe that was part of the image or the hierarchy of what you're going to do? Now, do you see new law forms or changes where that whole look and feel is not even going to be in place when someone walks in?
Well, it still is relevant at some of the much more expensive and particularly big city, big law firms. When you walk into the reception, there's typically a glass enclosure that looks right into the library, and it looks like all these busy people are running around pulling books. The reality is that most of those libraries are underutilized, and people are sitting at their desks with their terminals, often 2 screens, sometimes 3 screens, sometimes 4 screens, kind of like trading stations.
Right.
They've got 4 screens open with 4 different windows doing 4 different things. And they don't even step foot in the library. And then it's a constant struggle at the partnership level. We had it at my old firm, so I remember it. Why are we buying books? Why are we storing books? Why are we moving books around? Why do we have a librarian? Now they call them library scientists, or more generally information scientists.
Yeah.
Why do we have any of that? And there are still a few firms that say, well, you got to have a library if you're going to be a law firm. But I think it's becoming fewer and fewer.
Yeah, very good. Well,
but to get back to the too big to fail, what happens when you have a firm, and take the airlines, that's a good example, because the airlines do have certainly have a big role in what might be called a backup military inventory of planes. So if you're looking from a strategic point of view, every Delta pilot, every United pilot, every American Airlines pilot, and there's a gazillion other airlines, as we know, there are probably less than a gazillion by the end of this year. But typically, the view is we cannot furlough all those pilots and all those planes, because if we do that, we don't have readiness if really push comes to shove.
Exactly.
And that's why there's a certain military attitude in those airlines about people showing up on time and getting demerits and getting, AWOL notices and all that jazz. You work for Delta, so you remember how it worked, right?
Well, I could also tell you that you make a good point, because I know, because I spent 16 years in that industry, I could tell you that there is an expensive cost associated with an airplane sitting around doing nothing in many ways. Not just lack of revenue, but there has to be a certain amount of maintenance once it sits and doesn't fly for a certain amount of time, and the pilot's got to be retrained and all these kinds of things. So yeah, you're right. It's an unbelievable undertaking when you have that big of a company.
I'll tell you, Joe, you have your direct knowledge from working at Delta. I have my direct knowledge that for a couple of years, more than a couple of years, like 10 years, I was single and I was dating, and 1 or 2 of the women that I were dating, one for a longer period than the other, she was an airline stewardess.
That's
server?
Flight attendant. Be careful.
Flight attendant. Let's get this right. Let's be careful. Flight attendant.
I'm gonna have to edit this.
I won't name her by name, but she was very senior at a major airline. I won't even mention the airline.
All right.
And I learned all of the codes and tricks and everything to do with how that airline worked, and how you got free flights, and how you got onto a waiting list, and how you got first class, and how you got this and how you got that. And I'll tell you something, the thing that was very clear to me is the people that work for the airlines, they really do see it as, they have a lot of freedom in their life. A lot of them work like 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Some of them work like 2 days a week. Some work 3 days a month. Some of them work a couple of days a month just to keep their seniority. And the airlines has adapted its infrastructure for allowing that kind of replaceable workforce, where people are slotted in, not slotted in, are available on call, not available on call. And so they've kind of advanced the notion that you're just another cog in the system. You're not critical to us.
Right.
We can make this work. So in the too big to fail model, typically no one employee is like Elon Musk. Without Elon Musk, I think Tesla would falter, because he is like their Jesus Christ. I mean, he is like the Son of God who came down from heaven. Elon, if you're listening, I'm really saying this seriously, and you should get a raise. He's got a pretty big bonus plan. And, at the end of the day, if Tesla lost Elon Musk, I think that stock would lose 2/3 of its value. If he walked into work tomorrow and said, I am so fed up with this job because I can't get people to show up, or I can't get the state of California to straighten up its act, I'm going to move this. I'm telling the board of directors, we're moving this whole thing to Nevada. And the board said, no, we're not. And he said, adios. I am telling you, there would be complete civil war within Tesla and the shareholder base about how could you say that to the Son of Man? How could you tell him that he's going to get crucified on the altar of a termination? Are you nuts? Yeah. There is no successor to him right now. There isn't even anyone identified yet as a successor. Well, you know what? Like the rest of us, he's getting older. And sooner or later, he's probably going to say, I got my flight to Mars lined up next year, man. I'm out of here. And, you know, that announcement is going to come like a punch below the belt. Yeah. And I'll tell you, too big to fail, it doesn't always apply. There are some companies that really do not have a perfect system in place to slot people in. I think the airlines do. I think by and large, even the CEO of these airlines, it doesn't matter who you put in there. It just doesn't matter. Everything is sort of operated out of a certain set of systems. I think with Tesla and the idea that someone is actually rolling out new product ideas daily, and this guy is constantly thinking of, you know, new businesses and new opportunities, man, I tell you, if they lose him, they lose 2/3 of their market value. And that's a compliment to him and a compliment to the board of directors in keeping him motivated, because, you know, if you're a billionaire 2 or 3 or 5 times over, as he might well be right now due to the success of the stock lately, it's not about money anymore. Yeah, well, I don't know that it's about money for some of those guys anyway, but you're right. It is a timing thing. When's the right time that they said we're off to something else, or I'm going to spend my time and energy doing something else? So how would you let's wrap the too big to fail up? We just got a couple minutes left here. So I think there's at least 3 cases to think about in the too big to fail. There's the government-backed businesses that are too big to fail. Let's just call that the airlines. Right. Because the airlines are not going to be allowed to fail. There's just too many consequences, right? Think of it as the government will sponsor them forever. And it's a little bit like Air France just got a big bailout check, or is about to, from the country of France. But you know what? Country of France is putting conditions saying you got to get rid of things, and it's going to be painful. So there's going to be a transformation. But those airlines, the big ones, are going to stay. A lot of the smaller ones probably will merge in or get sold or go to bankruptcy. But by and large, the big ones will remain for strategic reasons. Right. The too big to fail of what might be called like the auto industry players, where there also is a military aspect to it, but there's other aspects, which is just too many people are working for these companies. Yeah. You can't displace them, which is why Obama bailed them out. They'll probably be bailed out again because of what's playing out right now. That's a second type of class that's very close to the first class. And then there's this third group, which is the information services company. They're almost too big to fail too, because imagine a world without Google. I think we'd go nuts. Soon imagine a world without Zoom. People would go nuts. Good point. Do you think that, as we wrap up, Jack, do you think that since 2008 and 10, in the bank, the lending bailout, you think they'd take a different view this time around? Is that too big to fail, or has that changed, you think? No, I think that's too big to fail as well. And the only difference might be that we're going to see if there is a regime change here, and I don't know if Biden will be that regime change, but there will be eventually a pushback that, look, if the CEOs are milking the company and not really doing the right thing in terms of taking money that ends up making its way to the C-suite executives as opposed to the downstream employees, I think we'll see some new tax regime that will tag them hard, meaning if you're a banker and you're making over $10 million a year, you might have to pay 80% of that in tax. So you might be a lot smarter saying, look, I want to buy the goodwill of my employees. I'm just going to pay it back to the government anyway. It's just a circular thing. So I think we might see some of that, but there will be continued bailouts of the big banks, only because there is such a worry, if there isn't, that somehow there won't be a replacement for the banks, when we do know there is an entire fintech industry that's just dying to deliver digital transmission of money and digital accounting and digital everything. And the banks are just doing as much as possible to slow that down, to adopt some of it, to buy some of it, to license some of it. So, by and large, it's not easy to be president of the United States. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump has done much good for the country. I'm sure his scorecard is at best a C- or a D. but it's a tall order to be a president of the United States. I mean, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I think Joe Biden, whoever gets this next vote, and maybe it's going to be Joe Biden, but I have to tell you, you have to be in perfect athletic shape to really put that 4-year sprint in. And I don't think any of the candidates are. I don't think any of us would be.
Good point.
I wasn't even sure that Buttigieg would be, and he's probably in the best shape of all.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can take a 78-year-old guy who's going to be 80 in his third year in office and say, you're going to do a great job. And I would say the same thing for Elizabeth Warren, and she was pretty sparky too.
Tells you what we got to look forward to. So before we wrap up, remind everybody where they could reach you.
So I still pick up the phone here. It does actually ring a lot because I'm learning a lot from picking up the phone. We have a receptionist that is screening kind of the solicitors and the like. So solicitors, don't call us. But the number for those who are serious is 650-327-9800. We do have offices in Palo Alto and San Francisco. We might actually open an office in Santa Clara or San Jose.
Yeah, I think that's time.
Of clients.
Yeah,
we have a lot of clients, and there's a lot of really low-cost space now. So maybe having a meeting place office in like Los Gatos.
We got some space for you right here.
Right, I know. I figured I'd throw that in. No, and cover the entire Silicon Valley from the deep south to the further north. In fact, I've said to my wife, my lovely wife, maybe we need an office at Stinson Beach over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah.
Because let me tell you something, there's a lot of smart people up there.
Oh, yeah.
A lot. And they're there. They're at Stinson Beach or West Marin or Bolinas. Well, Bolinas is off the map, but that's the point, right? And you could say Silicon Valley now covers that entire stretch, almost going to the Oregon border.
Yeah.
Probably almost going to Los Angeles to the south. So it's a lot of space. And we still believe that you have to meet people and talk to people. It just isn't happening. And it probably won't happen for another few months.
It'll come back. Well, Jack, thanks. We'll do it next Thursday. Hopefully if the schedule's
Absolutely. We've got to do what caught in the middle. What happens when you're a company that's not too big, not too small, and you are on the brink of failure? What do you do to turn it around? And that's going to be an interesting discussion because I'm seeing a lot of those businesses scramble and try as hard as they might. They might well not be able to get into one category or another, and they'll just close down. And we are in that category, not ours, but there are law firms that are.
Before we finish up today, real quick, why don't both of us try to see if we could get a business owner to actually call in, and we could do an interview with a real person that's going through a struggle and have he or she walk us through what they're going through. That would be a great show.
Well, the best version of that would be to take a really successful restaurant, and there are a number of them here in Palo Alto. They are basically begging. I mean, they're at the point of not just selling prepaid gift cards. They're at the point of saying, look, we want to make sure our people don't leave. Would you just gift some money to them if you like the food that they serve? The equivalent of give them a tip now as opposed to later if you ever want to see them again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty dramatic statement at some restaurants that are really she restaurants here.
Well, why don't you see if you can find one of your restaurants in Palo Alto to come on with us next week?
I'll do the research and hope that I can get someone looped in.
All right, Jack. Good talking to you.
Good seeing you. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Joe Kuchera, Real Estate Radio Live. Thank you again for those that are tuning in. For more information, you can always go to RERadiolive.com. Take care. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Real Estate Radio Live. For more information on today's program, visit RERadiolive.com. That's RERadiolive.com. Subscribe to our podcast. Discover more at RERadiolive.com.